أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان الرجيم من همزه ونفخه ونفثه بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسولنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Let's continue inshallah our session with some check-ins. How was your weekend? What are some of your initial thoughts when you wake up every day? What comes to your mind first in terms of the rest of your day, in terms of what you're looking forward to, and in terms of what you're stressed about, in terms of just about how you wake up, essentially. It doesn't have to be anything in particular, but anything that comes to your mind initially. Maybe you don't wake up in the morning because of certain thoughts, immediately. Or maybe you wake up, you jump out of bed and stuff, you're excited for the day. Maybe it's, just a typical day, for example. But what does your day look like? What is your early part of the day look like? Or what does it look like when you wake up in the morning, essentially? What does that look like in your mind? And what do the terms happiness and success mean to you? Now, these are two separate terms. Just keep that in mind. And how do your definitions relate to your goals and processes? Meaning, how does happiness connect with your goals and the processes you choose to take? And how does success relate to these as well? So just kind of how do they interconnect? Plans activity. Someone reaches out to you and notes that he is depressed and with possible suicide ideation. Now, suicide ideation is that they had thoughts of committing suicide, and it may or may not have actually it may or may not be alongside a plan, or the plan may or may not exist alongside this ideation. As in, they may have thought about committing suicide, but they may not have had actually thought of a plan on how to do it, right? Or maybe they have thought of a plan on how to do it. So these are some things that would fall under the general umbrella of ideation. But let's say there is possible ideation. Let's assume also that this person had thoughts, but then they sort of assumed, or not assumed, but they sort of like told themselves that they're not going to commit suicide, because in Islam, suicide is not allowed. And this person therefore felt like, okay, you know what? I'm not going to commit suicide, but still my life is very rough, and I would have committed suicide had it not been for this prohibition of suicide. Okay? And this suicide we're talking about, suicide of due to feeling overwhelmed and stressed out and feeling incapable of doing whatever needed to be done, for example, to help a person feel good and happy and content and all that. Okay? And then this person tells you that everything that they're doing is not working out the way they want. They feel that they see themselves oftentimes sort of sitting and just reflecting on how things are not going the way they would like for things to go. They also feel that there are people in their family or their co-workers or friends or teachers or whoever that are bothering them because of how they're like sort of having their own life work out a nice way, but they're sort of treating this person as if this person's life should also somehow be good, or that it can be good and stuff. And they're sort of projecting their own success or their processes and things like that on this person, and that's not helping this person, because it's only making this person feel sort of frustrated that they're trying, but things are not going their way, but then people are thinking that they're not trying at all, and so on, right? And they're just kind of giving statements like, well, you could try, you could do this and stuff, and that's that, right? So this is how the person is feeling. They're also feeling, this person is, I mentioned he, so let's assume that it's a he. This person is feeling that he is unable to change how someone else is doing things that might be hurting others that he cares about. And this person might be described to be a careless person or a carefree person, meaning they are not really mindful of what they're doing and the mistakes that they might be making or who they might be hurting and so on, right? So that's this part right here. And then this person has also there before distanced themselves from people, and they end up not really hanging out with people much. And even if they do, they sort of don't feel too comfortable around too many people and stuff, and they just go with one or two people. And even with them, their relationship is not like a strong friendship, it's just sort of like acquaintance, although they might have been friends before and so on. Okay. Another thing that happens is that their sleep schedule is reversed. Like at night, they just stay up and they are not able to go to sleep because all these thoughts are in their mind about how things are not working out. And so they just, stay up thinking about all those things and stuff until the morning comes. And then in the morning, they take a nap or they go to sleep and they wake up in the late afternoon or something like that. And this is something that's also therefore impacting their regular functioning and their ability to work and things like that. And at the end, this person just wants people to care about them, but they're feeling that people are not doing that. What do you do? Okay. In the meantime, let's go over this. Just some review. And I'm going to keep this here so that you guys can keep reviewing them. The more you get exposure to it, the more recall that comes in, right? The more it will be useful, inshallah, to reinforce those concepts in your mind. And here are some case studies that you could look at if you wanted to, or we can look at them if somebody wanted to, or we can come up with our own. So with this, let us go ahead and see if there's anything that you have in mind that you want to go over. So if you want, you can mention in the chat or unmute yourself and mention.
I don't know if this is like good for doing this. It's just what came to mind. I feel like I struggle a lot to just like sit down and learn things, like sit in a classroom or sit down and study something. And then I also feel like that's a means to a lot of my goals. So it's been hard to like get good at it and like want to do it. I just feel like my brain gets fried like with very little material, and it takes me a long time to process things sometimes.
Okay.
So I don't know if this is something that we could do, but that's what came to mind.
I think there's a lot of people that feel this way. So let me actually go over that a little bit. We can start off, and if we need to add more things and stuff, we can do that in the future, inshallah. So here, your goal is to become comfortable. Let's say become comfortable. Become comfortable with studying, yeah? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, studying and learning.
Okay, so let's say learning. So first of all, this is a very tricky topic because when you say learning, we have to define what learning actually means, or at least what learning definition we're using in our particular conversation. So what do you mean by learning? Okay, so what I'm going to do under reality, I'm going to ask you to define what learning means. What does learning mean? What does it mean? How do you learn? What does it mean to learn? What are some things that I learned?
I think learning is when you retain information and you're able to apply it in real life situations.
Okay, so the definition you here. Learning is equal to what? Retain information. And what did you say after that?
And being able to apply it to like situations.
How does that sound? Is this your definition there?
Yeah, that sounds good. Yeah.
Okay. So in this case, you mentioned two things. Number one, actually three things. Number one, obtaining the information. Number two, retaining it. And number three, using it or implementing it in a particular context. Okay. Now that is again a very, 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 very huge framework, let's call it, or umbrella, right? So that means that we have to define what kind of information we're talking about and what do you consider information, right? And it might sound like I'm being kind of really picky about this, but when you actually go into this discussion, if you actually Google what information means, and what does information mean? When you actually get to theoretical discussions about this, you're going to notice that the philosophers of education or of language and like concepts like this, right, don't actually have a single definition of what information actually means. Okay, they have different conceptions or these ideas in their minds, and they explain them differently. So if I was to ask somebody who is a person that deals with the theory of knowledge and information and so on, the question would be over here, what is the definition of information? And is information something that is static across all minds, or does information change for the perception of the person or the experiences of a person? What is the definition of information, and how is information perceived by human minds and stuff? So this is the intersection between philosophy, between education, between psychology, and various other fields. So all of these things are being pulled together over here when we talk about this. So here, this is why I'm asking you these questions. What do you mean by information? What kind of information? What are the parameters, boundaries? Why that information? Why not other pieces of information? Does that make sense? Now, theoretically, we can get into all these discussions, right? Practically, though, we're going to have to set some boundaries so we at least understand where we're going. Okay. If we understand the theoretical framework, it definitely does help us in terms of understanding how to qualify or restrict the definition to a particular context. So we're more pragmatic. But at the same time, even if we don't have the theoretical understanding of these concepts or these words, it may still be useful to at least put down some boundaries. And in this particular context, because we're actually giving an example, I'm not actually working with somebody to kind of guide them in this process. And because we're only spending a few minutes on this, I'm not going to go into details, kind of exploring the theoretical frameworks. But I just want us to understand this concept over here of how how these words need to be defined, and how there is this theoretical background that you have to consider, but then you also have to understand how to be pragmatic in terms of being able to apply and be functional in terms of these words and so on, or these concepts. So in this particular context, we're just going to go briefly over it. We're going to make a lot of assumptions here. And again, those assumptions may not be relevant or valid in other contexts. But for the sake of this example, we're just going to make some assumptions over here. So we are going to assume that information here, or actually, let me let you actually explain what it is that you consider as information that you would look forward to learning, and why.
I think it's anything that you could remember.
So we're talking about facts or what?
It doesn't always have to be. Well, I mean, yeah, let's just go with facts because that's the most useful.
Okay, so are we saying facts here specifically, or are we talking about facts plus something else?
Wait, say that again?
Are we only restricting to facts, or are we going to include concepts and theories and other things?
Yeah, I mean, we could do concepts and theories and ideas.
Okay. So
And just also like little details about things. Just like you need to remember this number or this name of something.
okay, details, descriptions, and we're just gonna call it textbook information. And what I mean by this here is just information that you can actually memorize, and like you read it somewhere and then you can like repeat it enough times to have it in your brain or something like that. Okay. Now the question is this information that you're talking about, what are the means for obtaining this information?
It could be books or a class or work or what's that?
Which ones are you talking about specifically?
Books and classes, and I guess those would be the main two.
Okay. And let's talk about implementation. So how would you imagine implementing? Give me a scenario. Like, what does it look like for you to?
Okay. Learning about a concept in a book, a science book, and being able to use what you learned on the exam question or at work or something.
Okay, so work.
Trying to tell someone like a story or like a hadith that you learned, and like giving it to them.
Okay, so we're talking about learning and information being something separate. Okay, now one thing I want to make a note of over here. A lot of times, what we consider facts may not be considered actually facts in the grand scheme of things, because it may just be a perception that we have. And remember, we talked about facts in two ways. And we talked about truths in two ways, right? And we mentioned that one of them is where we assign some word or something like that to a particular thing, or a concept or an idea, like it's some noun. We identify it, so the identification we give it, so we can refer to it anytime we need to, is going to be one type of fact, right? And that's something, for example, we point at the sun and we say that thing in the sky, that round thing in the sky, think during this part, from this time to this time, for example, and so on, is going to be what we call the sun, right? And the round thing that might not always be around at night is going to be what we call the moon. And when we look at trees, for example, we have a general framework of what trees look like, and so we might point to to multiple trees and say, okay, these are all considered trees, and whatever the definition of tree is, because obviously that would have to be defined as well, right? So that's one type. Another one is for example, how something works, how gravity works. There are theories about it, but there hasn't been some sort of complete description because of complete understanding of how gravitational fields work and so on, right? So in this particular context, there's two different things. So when we consider facts or truths, there's the types that we assign certain we designate certain phrase or word, right, or sound associated to some word, which is then associated to a particular concept or a thing or whatever. And then there's also the other one, which is how things might work. For example, the processes behind things and things that we don't actually know about and so on. So we haven't yet been able to identify. So those would also fall under facts. Now, some of those things may be perceptions, and perceptions may not necessarily align with the capital T truths or reality, right? And sometimes they might. So facts over here is it has to be defined as well. What do we mean by facts? right? And normally I wouldn't go into this kind of discussion. I'd be more, practical about things and stuff, in the sense that we would discuss, for example, what a person wants, and we would break it down into stages that the person can get it, right? But because I'm presenting it, into a public audience here, I do intend to sort of explore this concept a little bit deeper. It's not just surface level. Okay, here's the word fact, and that we're just going to assume whatever comes to our mind, and every person's perception of the word fact and the definition that each person might give might differ, because there is no single definition necessarily that everyone agrees on. And likewise, the word truth, or the word information, or the word implementation, or the the means of obtaining information, all that, many people may not actually agree on these things. Actually, I would even go to say that most, if not all, people are going to have most, or if not all, people are going to have different definitions for these things, and they're going to be very different, or some of them are going to be slightly different, but there are going to be differences. Okay, so just keep that in mind. Just because it might be in dictionary.com or the Merriam-Webster dictionary doesn't necessarily mean that this is how things are. And even if you go from Oxford English Dictionary to Merriam-Webster's dictionary, and then to go to dictionary.com or whatever, you're going to find there are differences in the definitions and so on, because of that same reason. So this is why a lot of the scholars, when they write things, or even when I say scholars, I'm going to include non-Muslims that are talking about different subjects other than Islam. So I'm going to be very generic in my usage over here. And again, notice I define that, because in one particular context, a scholar would be, for example, Muslim scholars and stuff, right? But even in that case, if we break it down in a particular field, a scholar that might be a scholar in hadith may not be necessarily a scholar of, for example, usul fiqh, for example, right? And that's okay. It just just have to understand what you're talking about. So every field of study often has its own particular jargon, or its own particular terminology, and then they define it a certain way, and then they go forward. If you wanted to go into fiqh, for example, and you wanted to study the 4 schools of fiqh, right? Imam Abu Hanifa's, or like the not Imam Abu Hanifa, but the general Hanafi madhab, and I'm going to say it like that because, as you know, that it was Iraqi fiqh that was consolidated, and it included the opinions of Imam Abu Hanifa, his framework. It was also including the contributions made by others in that time period, in that locality, but also by Imam Abu Hanifa's students and so on. So there's a lot of that goes into that. So there's a lot of unpacking that needs to happen there. However, generally, let's assume that if it's the Hanafi madhab, that's Imam Abu Hanifa's madhab, and then we're going to say that in there's certain terminology that is used that is different than other terminology. For example, there is a differentiation between what is fard and what is wajib in the Hanafi madhab, right? So if you go to a different madhab, for example, they might have the same words used in a different way. So you would have to understand the terminology of that particular group of people, that particular in-group of people, in-group meaning like there's an in-group and out-group, whatever that in-group sort of defines, and that's how we understand it. So for example, the word soda or pop, right? For example, these are different words for something that might be the same thing, right? They just have different designations from different groups of people. And so in that group of people, you'll understand what that means. When you go overseas, for example, let's say you go to England, for example, and somebody, or like let's say you go to Australia, for example, or some of those places might have different words for the word friend. In one place it might say mate or something like that, right? So just understanding that there are different usages, and we need to understand what that means. And so that in reality, that's not only limited to those particular fields of study, but this kind of terminology gets used in multiple places across the world in different areas. For example, it may sound sort of like a stretch when I say this, but if you understand the fundamental concept that I'm trying to explain here, you understand that it's the same thing, right? And that is the usage of language. So different people refer to the same thing with different sounds, right? Sounds meaning the words that they're speaking. There's different sounds that they're making. So, for example, in Chinese, referring to the house, this house, there might be a word for that. There is a word for that, and that word is the sound that is made to make that word, pronounce that word essentially, right? That sound is going to be different than the English word for house, or the Urdu equivalent for house, or the Arabic equivalent for house. But they're referring to the same thing, right? So there's different terminology, but people sort of understand what is being referred to in that circle, in that group of people. They understand what is being referred to when different sounds are made. Okay, but what the boundaries to these words may sometimes differ. Maybe there are certain synonyms that have different boundaries, but they have similarities as well. So they have some overlaps, but they also have some differences and stuff. So all of these things are just examples of how we are the ones that designate certain things to certain qualities or descriptions or whatever, or names, concepts and things and stuff like that. So you just understand that just because I'm using the word, for example, information, it doesn't necessarily mean that everyone has the same meaning for that. Just because I have a certain way of obtaining what I had defined as information, then doesn't mean that it's going to be the same. So many scholars, as I was saying, are going to define words that they're using, especially words that might especially be like different in their field of study, or because of different people using them differently. So they're going to define them in the first chapter or into the introductory chapter, or maybe in the second chapter. And every time it's used the first time, they would often define it before they continue that using that word thereafter, right? In other words, the first time something is used, they might say, for example, okay, this is the definition of this word right here that we're using. And then from that point onwards, the reader understands that every time that the author is referring to that word, the author is actually referring to that particular definition and not any other definition that somebody else might be using in their framework or in their textbook or whatever that you're reading and stuff, or whatever you're listening to, for example. I hope that's making sense. And I know that's kind of getting a little bit more theoretical, but this is the background of how everything is. That's pretty much how everything is, how everything works in life, essentially, right? We don't talk about it because we've gotten used to sort of our bubbles, for lack of a better word, and that's why it's a little bit hard for us to accept other people's frameworks. Right? A lot of times there's conflicts because we assume that whatever we have been exposed to, whatever our definitions are, they are necessarily definitions that other people also use for themselves. But that's not just that. The fact is that that's just not the case, right? People have different definitions, different understandings, different perceptions, and all that. So just keep that in mind. And also, one person's perception of how things are supposed to be does not necessarily mean that this is exactly how things are going to be like in reality, right? So just because I feel that this is how things are, it doesn't necessarily mean that I've understood capital T truth or reality. Again, that is my small t truth, and it may or may not align with the reality. My perception, what I think, right? If I'm referring to that perception as like the set of whatever's in my head, that right there is a fact, as in I can refer to it and say these things exist in this person's mind. But do those things match what the reality looks like outside the person's mind? Not necessarily, right? So even though you can say that, yes, I remember this and this and this, and that person might actually remember those things, but does that mean that that thing actually happened or not? Not necessarily. And so this is going into a little bit more of psychology and so on. So I just want that to be understood over here. Okay. So with that, I'm gonna go on to the next section. I just wanted to give you some background here because it's important for us to understand how to move forward, and that's why we're defining these terms over here, because we need to be sure of exactly what we're talking about over here. And earlier I asked you a definition of happiness, and I asked you a definition of success in the check-in questions. And I asked that because I wanted it to be understood how the definitions can be different for different people, and why if society sets a sort of norm and says this is what the definition of success should be, right, and it doesn't have anything to base it on, then it just becomes arbitrary, and it's just whoever's in power, whoever's making decisions and policies and so on, is the one therefore deciding for everyone else what it should be, whether or not that perception of that person or those groups of people that are actually putting down these policies and so on, right, and whether or not their perceptions are actually aligning with capital T truth or not. So it just happens, so we have to understand that. And likewise, when it comes to a lot of policies related to foreign relations, for example, international relations, for example, or when it comes to domestic, challenges that a person, a country might face, and so on, and like how to handle them, and so on, the responses, like in certain crises, for example, all of those things, right? Oftentimes can be just what a person feels is what they should be doing, whether they actually align with categorical truth or not. That's a different concept. So I hope that makes sense. Okay, so vision. Assuming those definitions, what is your vision at the end of the day? What do you want to? What do you want at the end of the day?
I want to I guess I want the whole process to come easier to me.
Okay, so I would ask you to define what process means, but I'm not going to do that. I'm going to assume that there is a particular definition that you're referring to, right? And I'm going to go with that definition, right? Again, I could be wrong in that definition because it might be different for you versus the definition that I might have in my head. So it might be different, right? But just for the sake of kind of like, going through the example, because that's the focus of this part right here. And the focus is not to go into those other things. So I'm just going to assume that people understand what the word process means, but it's not the same, and it is something that's very ambiguous. In fact, it's one of those words that there is no consensus on necessarily of what that means. It's a very like vague word, and it makes it seem sort of like very powerful, but in reality, if you ask somebody how to like define the word process, right, you're going to find that the people are going to have different definitions and stuff. And I'm talking about here experts and people that are in different fields, and each person in a different field, right? Meaning every person that is in a different field compared to every other person in different fields, they're going to have differences in the definition. Okay, so you want to be efficient in the process. Now, I want to make another clarification over here. So I'm using the word vision over here. Typically, we've used vision to say the end goal, as in like what you want by the end of your life, essentially, to have accomplished. Here, we also mentioned that vision, I'm using it just to refer to that, but we used, I believe we used goals and things like that for something that was a subcomponent, meaning like a milestone, a checkpoint, essentially, right? And I said that that's something that we can use to differentiate between the two, but the concept that I'm referring to, that you're going towards something, the concept is the same. I'm just using the vision to mention something that's at the end of the day, but you can also use vision in your definition to refer to a goal that you have for the next 5 years as opposed to the end of your life. You can still call that a vision. I just decided to use a particular terminology, and I defined that earlier when we were talking about that. So keep that in mind, that I am differentiating it, but you don't need to differentiate it, because again, it's how you use it and how you define that at the very beginning of your conversation, for example. Okay, so vision. Here we're gonna assume that this is not your end goal in life, but it is like a smaller subset of your end goal, right? So we're gonna call this in that the way we've been using it. We'll call it a goal or like an objective or something like that, right? Okay, so that's your goal, and your goal is to become proficient in this process. Is that what it is?
Yeah.
Okay. In the process of learning. Now, technically, I can ask you the question of what does proficient mean, and you should probably go into that, because you want to always have SMART goals as the acronym. And there's actually different acronyms and stuff for different framings of goals. But in this case, let's assume that proficient means that you get good at it by whatever that means and stuff, right? And again, we would actually go into a little bit deeper if we were actually dealing with this as a coaching case. But we're just kind of getting the example. So we're just going through the example, so that's why I'm not going deeper into it. But yeah, proficient in the process of learning. Now, we would ideally want to put in a time frame. So what does that look like, right? Time frame. What does that look like? How soon you want to get it done? That's something that you would mention here. Maybe you will mention, for example, within 1 year. Okay, let's say a 1 year goal. 1 year. And maybe you would also want to do, for example, do you measure if it's like it has to be measurable? So what does that mean? How would you measure it? The A is attainable. So we went it through reality to make sure that it was actually attainable. That's why we defined it. We actually can like figure out if it's attainable or not. And you said the means of obtaining is books and classes, so that's definitely obtainable. You can get a book and you can get classes and stuff like that. So it's attainable like that. So we don't have to go over that. And it is time sensitive. Okay. So measurable. Like how do you measure if you're improving or not? If you're getting towards your goal?
I feel more like I don't see it as much as a chore, and I come out I come out after reading a book or a class with more benefit.
Okay. So this would not actually. So this would have to be like qualitative measurement, qualitative, as opposed to a quantitative. So that means, I mean, we can make it also quantitative. Quantitative. How you spell it? Okay. So quantitative. You can also do that if you wanted to. And how would you do that? You would, the qualitative would be like, your description, like you can have a journal or something like that, that every time you do it, you sort of record your feelings and how, like what was going on and stuff, right? And if you feel like, you feel like you're improving, then that could be something that can be considered as improvement, right? And that could be measurable in that sense, right? But quantitative is where you can have a chart, not a chart, but like a numbering system. You could say, for example, you can like rate yourself 0 to 10, right? 0 being you were just like not happy with this, and then 10 is like you're completely competent, you feel good about it, you feel like you've achieved your goal, right? So you can sort of like over time, every time you go through it, you can have a survey at the end where you can kind of like go over it and like answer the question how you feel about it. And it could be like number 5, it could be a 5 or a 6 or a 7 or whatever. And as you progress, if the numbers are in fact increasing, then you can see quantitatively that you are actually getting to whatever your 10 was. Let's say you define 10 as achieving your goal, right? So then you can do that. So there's different ways to do this. Again, you can have a journal for qualitative, and you would also do for quantitative. You could just like do a survey right before and right after. So that would be like a post training and pre training and post training. Or you could just do it after it, or you could do it at the beginning of every one. Whatever is relevant in that context, we can go over that. But here we're just trying to like just map out how you would do something like that. So here we could say, for example, 10 for goal to. So like this is where 0 to 10, right? So 10 for, so 0 to 10. Okay, so that could be something that you could do, right? For qualitative, you could do a journal. Okay, so that's that. Now we can move on. Obviously, you would go a little bit deeper in this, but I am just kind of going into, and we're just kind of getting like basics of it, right? So let me duplicate this slide and remove this stuff. Actually, okay. Okay, now we're right this step right here. So what does it look like right now?
Currently, I just it's a chore for me to try to learn things.
Okay, so we're saying it's right now. Okay.
So it's undesirable.
Sure. So, and I'm gonna mention over here, can there be chores that are desirable, like you like doing those things?
Yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't matter of how you frame it. So it's very relative. A lot of these things, that we sort of assume are gonna be very like fixed are actually very relative. So just keep that in mind. Like chores, some people can enjoy certain chores. They just love them and stuff, and they look forward to doing them, right? Even though they're technically considered chores. If I ask you the definition of a chore, right? Some people might actually consider some of those things very appealing to them, right? And again, definitions of chores can actually be different for different people and so on. So just that needs to be understood as well. So here we are saying these chores are like when you refer to chores, the word chores, you mean undesirable. You don't want, but you don't like to do that. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah.
Like I'll get overwhelmed with even after just like a little bit of material.
Oh,
I don't retain as much as I would want to.
okay. Say low retention. And how do you define retention?
Being able to recall it afterwards.
Okay, so we're talking about low recall later.
Yeah.
Okay, and by that you don't mean the concept. You're just talking about like being able to recall the specific description and details.
Yeah. For the most part.
And the reason I say that is because, as you can see, recall could mean also recalling concepts, and you might actually recall concepts. Like you might do them fairly well, but when it comes to details, the descriptions of them, the names of certain things, you might not remember that. So you want to specify what you're actually talking about here.
Hey, your audio, it's been like kind of choppy. Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know if you did anything different today, but
has that been the case like throughout?
Like it's like on and on. Like it's not like sometimes it's better than other, but for the most part, it's been like rougher than usual, I think.
Okay. Okay. I don't know what happened. Maybe if I raise my voice and speak louder, maybe it'll be better. But let me know if that's not the case.
I think how you just talked is good.
Okay, so it might just be like I need to keep my voice raised.
Yeah.
Okay, so now we mentioned a little bit of this. Is there anything else currently that is sort of an obstacle or something that may actually be working fine? Like maybe there are some things that are working well right now, but you just want to maintain those habits and stuff. Is there anything like that?
I don't think so. Like I feel like I could always connect like what I'm learning to a deeper goal and stuff, but that doesn't help too much to me.
Okay, but there is internal motivation because you the reason you mentioned this this thing as a goal was because you're passionate about this in one way or another. You really want it to happen.
Yeah.
So there is that internal driver, which is good. This is actually a really good plus, because if you didn't have that, we would have to go and like build that motivation. But you already have that motivation, so this is good, right? And this would be actually something that you would consider over here. If the motivation is already there, I don't need to start from that thing right there. But I do need to make a connection connect between motivation and process. Okay, so maybe the process that you're using may not be the best, may not be the perfect process to actually get to whatever it is that you want. Again, we are using a particular definition. We're going to assume that everyone understands a general concept of process, right? We are not necessarily going to go into details about what that looks like just now. Actually, we're not going to do that today. But I want that to be understood that there are different definitions of process. We're just kind of going over the general thing, whatever might overlap with many people's definitions or in many people's definitions. Okay, so motivation might be connected It is connected to the process. And remember when we were talking about motivation, we talked about it earlier. Let me go back to that slide. Here, motivation, like in terms of you have different choices. You might sort of not have the full confidence in being able to, continue doing whatever it is that you want to do because you feel you're not really competent at it just now, right? Or just as of this moment, right? Um, and then you have a purpose behind it because you have, you want to, that learning is going to be part of other things, other achievements in life. So that's that. And then discipline is sort of like optimizing your process, your procedures, the steps you're taking, and so on. Okay. So let's continue from here then. So when we talk about that, or let me rephrase that, connect motivation and process, and I'm gonna make a note here by discipline. Okay. Now, what else? What are some other things that we can look at to determine how to get, or to actually focus on going from one to the next, from point A to point B? I'll give you a hint. It's about process breakdown, right? Breakdown. But we need to first talk about what you're doing currently that is making you overwhelmed. What do you do currently? What is your current process looking like?
It's not always, I don't know. I mean, just going to a class, that'll do it for me. It's not really a process, but and then just like starting to read a book or trying to like go back to your notes and reviewing them.
Okay. So I already have an idea of where the breakdown is happening, but I'm gonna sort of let you kind of figure that out a little bit. Okay. Let's go over that part, and inshallah after this we should be done with this activity here. So what's happening over here? Why do you feel that you're getting overwhelmed? I'll give you the hint is in here.
I don't know if this is the one you were thinking of, but like one thing that I notice is that like as I'm learning something, I'm afraid I'm gonna forget what I just heard, and then I'm trying to like retain that, and then also at the same time I'm hearing something new, and then that it's just like a cycle of getting something new, then worrying I'm gonna forget it, and then something new is added on top of that, and yeah.
So this is happening, right? Okay. And the worry over here that you're having is, how in the world am I going to keep up when all of this stuff is happening so fast like that?
Yeah, and it's not just like in the moment, it's also like in the longer term, because like I remember I wouldn't see the point in studying for an exam in college until a night before, because I know it's gonna all like leave my memory. Even if I felt like I learned it well, I knew like there would be a lot of holes in what I learned if I started even a few days beforehand.
So as a consequence, you end up procrastinating because you felt that was the optimal way of making sure that at least some information is really fresh in your mind.
Yeah.
So that's that. Anything else?
I think that's it.
So we're going to duplicate this. We're going to and that's that. Okay, so all right. So the issue over here is learning strategies. All right, let's call it learning study strategies. This is something that we need to work on. What are some ways to study so that you can actually retain the information better? Make sense? I've already identified that this right here is the main issue. Okay. And I think maybe a little bit of this because you feel like there's only one way that you can study. So this is sort of also where we can address that and say actually there's different ways of studying, and there are strategies that can be useful that you might not be aware of, and so therefore you're not actually being able to utilize in your studying process. So these two could be the thing. And so when you feel like there's only one way to study, and that is, for example, procrastinating the night before, then this is sort of feeling like you don't have another choice. Okay? When you are feeling that no matter what you try, and you might have only tried a few things because you might not have known there's other choices. So no matter what you do, you're just not being able to do it. Right? So again, in this, the breakdown is happening in the aspect of the process that you're following, and that's it. It's not that your vision is not attainable, and it's not that where you're at currently is necessarily like something that's like where you're stuck at forever. But it's just that when you're actually trying to go from A to B, the strategies that you're using are, number one, either too limited or restricted, right? Whereas in reality, there are other possibilities, other processes that you could use, right? Other strategies you can use, number one. Or number two, that because of certain, or number two, in the past, you might have had a lot of experiences where you kept on trying and you felt overwhelmed because things were not happening. So you sort of like developed this connection, a mental connection, that a particular experience, a particular attempt at trying to do something was definitely leading to a particular end consequence of overwhelm and frustration and things like that. So your brain made a connection every time you sit down to read a book. Then there was there was an experience at the end that this process was associated with, and that was failure, overwhelm, or whatever. Right? And so every time now you sit down to study, now you go to class and stuff, you're sort of not happy because your brain is automatically reminding you of the end result of that, right? From the brain's perspective, it doesn't want you to feel overwhelmed and stressed out and feel bad and stuff. So this memory is a good thing to keep you away from those kinds of activities that are making you feel that way, making you feel sort of like overwhelmed and stressed out and stuff like that, right? And so that's that. If you focus on, for example, learning this, multiple new strategies, or you take a class like a study skills class, for example, or you go to a person and try to, like a person who is an academic coach or a person who has, certain learning strategies that are useful and stuff, then you go to them and you explore different ways of doing things, then that is something that could definitely help over here, right? And so over here, it looks like, for example, one example would be if instead of, doing it at night, you can do a 15-minute study every single day with a concept in mind. And that concept is that studying or learning takes time, right? And it's not something that's going to happen the same day. So what you need to do is to understand that just like a person who goes to work out, right? They're not going to become like super buff and like super like, like heart healthy and so on. Like from a typical person to like a super like Olympic level athlete, that kind of physique and stuff, right? That doesn't happen overnight. It does take a lot of training and hard work and stuff, right? It might take like decades of it before you actually get to the place that you get to, right? So if you understand that and you accept that fact, you're aware of it, you understand that, and you accept it, then you can tell yourself, okay, so the key over here is to be consistent in my habits, and not think that I'm not going to be able to do it just because I didn't get it the first time around. There is this thing where there are certain like people that study successful people. They focus on what is an expert, and there are definitions that define 70,000 hours, I believe, I think that's the number, of practice, right, is what leads to a person becoming an expert. So there is 70,000, I believe, is the number, and that is a commonly sort of accepted number to determine what is one criteria, or not one criteria, one quality or characteristic of an expert, that they've spent about 70,000 hours of hard work and deliberate practice and so on that particular skill set. Okay, so it took a lot of time, and it kept a lot of repetition and so on before they got to where they got to. So here, maybe every day I go to class, I tell myself, hey, it's okay if you don't get it the first time, because this is how things are. I need to accept that. But to make sure that I can retain this longer, what I can do, one of the things I can do is that every day after I go home from school, I spend 15 minutes, let's say, reviewing that particular class, content that we went over, right? And whatever was relevant in that topic, I go 15 minutes reviewing all my notes. I spend that much time per class. That's it. And my idea over here is just that constant exposure. And I believe that I used the word recall in the past. I don't know where I used it, but I used the word recall, right? And the recall is very important. And that's one of the things, one of the reasons behind quizzes and exams is the process of recall. When you recall something, then it helps you sort of reinforce that in your mind. When somebody asks you a question, you have to go back in your mind and try to find the answer that relates to that description that was asked, right? That's if I ask you, for example, what is the capital of North Carolina, right? So when you were storing a particular memory in your mind, a particular piece of information, you had certain descriptions, right? So you might have had, for example, Raleigh, North Carolina, right? So Raleigh plus, let's say the state capital plus, you're putting it together and stuff, and then you're sort of implementing in your mind. You're saying that this is how it is. Let's say that's it, right? Then every time one of the descriptors is pulled up, meaning that question that you're asked in the quiz, the other one that was connected in your brain is going to also be triggered, and it's going to be the thing that's going to come to your mind because they come as a package. If you hit one of the descriptors, then the other ones associated would also be interconnected and stuff, so you can pull that from your mind and stuff. So you're just making associations. The more exposure that you have and the more recall that you do like this, right, and the answer is correct, for example, then in that case, it's going to build a stronger relationship between those things. So initially, it might be the first exposure, so you had a few different descriptions of that concept in your mind, but then you go back and review it again. So those connections are reinforced, right? Your brain says, okay, that's a connection, that's a connection, that's a connection. And hey, this person is telling me again that that's the same connection. So I'm going to, if you imagine that there's lines that are connecting 5 different, floating balls. Right? Let's say there's these little balls that are floating around, right? And there's 5, there's a string that connects them, right? Every time you reinforce that connection by going back and telling yourself that there is that connection there, then your brain is going to make the thread a little bit thicker, and you keep on doing that until eventually the thickness of it is so big that it's every time you think about one of the balls, you're going to remember all the other connections that are associated, and that's that, right? So every time you go back and review something, it reinforces that thread by making it a little bit thicker, so that connection is a little bit stronger. And so when you remember one of those things, the other ones that are related to it are also going to be brought in together. So that's the process of learning. And if you understand this process, then you can use the strategies that are going to be useful to reinforce this concept. If you understand how your brain works, you can customize your strategies, learning strategies and study habits to match the framework of the mind, or how the mind works, the functionality of the mind. So with that in mind, now you can optimize your strategies. Now it's not a daunting experience just because you didn't get it the first time, because you understand that, hey, learning takes time. It takes time for information to sink in and make connections with everything else that's in your mind and all your experiences that have taken place in the past and so on. So I hope that's making sense over here.
Yeah, it does.
So now you can tell yourself, okay, I go to class, I read a book. Maybe I just, if I'm getting overwhelmed with a book, no problem. Let me just start off with 1 page, and that's it. Let me highlight the things that I feel are necessary, and I'll read 1 page only. I'm not going to go beyond 1 page, and that's it. I read that page, I highlight it, I take notes in my book or whatever. I like to take notes in my book, So that's what I like to do. Some people have, they don't like to write in book, so you can have it on a separate sheet of paper. Sometimes I do both. Sometimes I might have a separate sheet of paper and I'm taking notes, and I'm also writing in my book. Sometimes, it depends on the context, right? It depends on what I'm doing. Sometimes it could be like, on your computer, it could be like different places and stuff. Whatever it's going to be easy for you to reinforce the learning process in your mind. If you understand the learning process, you can use whatever strategies that you feel comfortable with to help you along with that. Okay. So maybe you read one book. Sometimes if I'm reading a particular book and I feel like I'm going to be overwhelmed, or maybe like I want to be consistent in it, but it's also a very dense book, then I might just allocate for that particular book, maybe like 1 or 2 pages or 3 pages or 5 pages or whatever, and that's it. I stop. I tell myself I'm not going to go beyond that. Maybe you can put a time limit on it. Maybe you can say I'm not going to go beyond 15 minutes, even if I just read like 5 lines over and over again, and that's it. But after the 15 minutes, it's a hard stop, right? You can also do that. So these are
What
learning
about
strategies. Yeah.
sorry, what about like when you're under time constraints, like in college, you don't have that sort of time to be able to like let yourself process information. It's like you have to learn this by this date, end of story,
Yeah, so this is where time management is going to come in. If you have to learn by some time, colleges and teachers and professors are usually realistic about things and stuff, right? Now, if you're not spending much time, like they'll tell you, for example, outside of class, you might have to spend like 6 to 8 hours, let's say, per class, right? If you're not doing that and you're taking 5 classes and stuff, right, then that is where you're sort of like telling yourself that like you're not actually putting the effort in, right? Teachers might be expecting from you to spend, let's say, 6 to 8 hours per class outside of the class. Okay, but let's say you're only spending 1 or 2 per week per class, right? So obviously you're not actually managing your time effectively because you're not dedicating the time that might otherwise be useful in actually addressing the situation you're going through, right? So it may not be as much of I don't have enough time. It may just be, okay, let's see if we're managing our times effectively. I like to use Google Calendar, and I've been using that for a long time. I use that in college. I use that, since then. I've been using it like all the time, right? Before that, I believe before Google and smartphones were like a big famous thing stuff, that I used to use agenda books. So I would write down my homework and stuff. I would like put, for example, for homework assignments, or anything that was assignments that were due, right, like projects and tests or quizzes or whatever that were gonna take place on a certain day, or they were due on a certain day. I would put them the day that were due or the day that we would be given those assessments, for example, tests and quizzes, right? So I would plan ahead by seeing how many days I had left, since until that assignment is due, or until that test is, or until the project is due, or whatever it might be, right? And I would kind of like pace myself accordingly. But when the smartphones came out and Google Calendar was a thing, right? So I started putting the stuff on there. And at the beginning of my semesters, the dates the professors would give for homework assignment due dates, or the quizzes or tests or final exams or whatever, I would put those dates at the very beginning, in the first 3 months of the day of class, into my calendar. So then I would know like how many days are left, what's going on, all that stuff would sort of like happen in my mind simultaneously. And it would be something that, I would have a framework for the beginning of class. I would read the syllabus, I would understand what the class is all about, and this is how I'd proceed. So if you're doing that, then this is great, because you're letting your brain sort of have an expectation of what is going to happen moving forward. And if you don't have those expectations, then you're running pretty much arbitrarily and randomly, and then that's not effective. So here, time management strategies are going to be good. Learning and study habits are going to be good too, right? Strategies related to them. And so here is where the process that I'm seeing needs some optimization. And that's it. It's not that you're not capable of doing it. It's not that people, are just born like capable of doing all these things and stuff, right? It's more that there is some practice that gets involved, that you have to do certain things. You have to know how to do things correctly. It's not just doing things, it's doing them correctly, right? And then, maintaining those habits. You could also like try to swim, for example, but if you don't actually go through an instructor or somebody who knows how to swim and learn from them, it's like an experiment. You're just trying to figure out on your own stuff, but it doesn't actually mean that you're going to be succeeding. So no matter how much effort that you put in, you may not actually become better at swimming, because you don't know how to swim, and you're not learning from somebody who knows how to swim, right? Or who figured it out, or whatever, right? Likewise, you can sit there and try to, for example, try to cook, right? And you have a bunch of ingredients in front of you, and you can go to the store and buy whatever you want and stuff, but you have never looked at a recipe, you've never like learned how to cook and stuff, nobody taught you and stuff like that. You just know that there's, you know, all these like things that you could put together, and you keep trying, and every time you try, the food tastes horrible because it's like it's weird, right? And so you can keep going like that for a long time, or you can go to a person who knows how to cook and just learn from them, right? So just because you're putting a lot of time and energy and effort does not necessarily mean that you're going to be successful. You have to know what the strategies are that are like correct strategies or useful or beneficial strategies, and then learn them and use them. And then at the same time, you have to remember that things are not done necessarily overnight. They do take practice and stuff that I typically see. So here, that's what I'm identifying over here as the issue.
But I mean, if like say like you do manage your time well, but still though, like at the end of the day, it takes you longer than what it's supposed to take you to learn something. You know,
Have you learned a strategy and then used it for 70,000 hours?
have I learned out? Say that again.
Yeah. Have you learned a strategy, like a learning strategy,
Mm-hmm.
like study habit? You actually learned it from somebody who knows how these things work and stuff, right? Have you learned something like that from them, and then use them for 70,000 hours? I know I'm being like, you know, overly like whatever, but has that happened? Have you learned actual strategies from people that are, you know, they teach you study skills and stuff like that? Have you actually gone through somebody to teach you these strategies, or did you just figure that they are? You just heard it from, you know, some one of your friends or somebody that was doing something and stuff, and you just decided to use it? Like, how did you acquire these strategies that you're using currently?
I mean, they're just strategies that you learn throughout the years of school. Like sometimes teachers will tell you strategies, sometimes you just learn it on your own.
What does it
But
mean learning?
what's that?
What does it mean learning on your own?
What does it mean to learn on my own?
Yeah, because you said sometimes you're gonna learn the strategies on your own.
I mean, you just see what works for you, um, like like reading a book and then putting notes to the side. For example, you notice that helps or something.
Okay, so what is it that's overwhelming you then? Because we talked over here that you're overwhelmed, you feel like it's a chore, and you said that it's low retention. Doesn't that mean that things are not working?
Right.
Okay, so that's something to think about. By the way, fear of forgetting can actually make you forget even more than if you didn't have that fear. So this perception that you might have in your mind that I'm gonna forget, I'm gonna forget, I'm gonna forget, might actually end up making you forget. So just removing that thought could be a big hurdle that you just remove out of your path.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you could tell yourself, yeah, don't be afraid of this forgetting. Tell yourself, yeah, it is very likely I'm gonna forget the first time around, but the second time it might be a little bit less likely I'm gonna forget, or it's more likely that I'm gonna remember. And the third time is gonna be even more likely that I remember if I keep on reviewing like that, right? And so you're remembering that you're filling an empty glass. So like that's how it is. Don't assume that just the first exposure is gonna give you a full glass and you just have to keep it full. That's not how it should be, right? You should remember it's an empty glass. The first exposure was a drop in the glass. The second exposure to review, right, is going to be another drop and third drop and so on. And the glass is going to keep filling up until you get to the top. That's it. So the fear itself is because you assume that the glass needs to be full at the first instance, and it has to remain like this. And if it's not gonna remain like that, then it's gonna be bad. It's gonna look bad on you, or like maybe it's like showing that you're not capable of learning and stuff like that. That framework is the issue over here too. So you can remove that and say, wait, why am I framing it like that? The reality is that the brain works by, you know, the model that I mentioned. There's like a thin line that's made initially between two things or multiple things, and then the more you can, you know, revisit that concept and you think about it more, you review it, the more the thicker the lines become, the connections become. So with that in mind, you no longer think of it as that, because the thin line is like one drop. The thicker line is the second drop added on, and the thicker line beyond that is going to be a third drop, and so on and so on. And so that's how it works out. So you see that The strategies that you might have learned may have been things that you figured might work temporarily. They might help you remember, right before the test. Like procrastination was a strategy that you figured would be useful, but it was a result of feeling incapable of like retaining information before that, right? So when we talked about, for example, procrastination, that was a result of like this stuff right here, right? But that was because of misunderstanding how learning works, how the brain works. And that was an assumption that you made, for example, that this is how it's supposed to be, and that's it. So instead, what if you say, for example, I would go to some people that have learned and acquired and mastered how to learn, right? I want to go to them and ask them what are actual effective strategies, and I can see what I can try them out, and I can also learn how the brain works, so I can understand what framework should I be looking at learning with. And then you can change your framework to match that reality and go from there. Now, technically, you would go over here a little bit and borrow that in this concept right here when you're assessing. Is your current conception, is your current understanding of how learning works correct, or is it not correct? You might think it's correct, but it doesn't mean that it's correct, because the capital T truth might be different than your small t truth. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Did that help kind of like, give you an understanding of how things like this would be done?
Yeah, I think so.
And notice that we haven't actually gone into daily routines and things like that. That's why we didn't break that. I just wanted to give you like a general step 3 sort of like framework.
Yeah. And just a heads up, it's 9 o'clock now.
Okay, so we're gonna stop, inshallah. Let's go ahead and today we didn't have our timer, so okay. So let's go ahead and conclude by saying, if you had, or actually, we can leave this for next time, or should we go over this now? It's up to you.
We could just go over it next time because it's getting kind of late.
Okay, sounds good, inshallah. So we'll go ahead and conclude, inshallah. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك